All right, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Here is our lesson summary for lesson 13, and this lesson focused primarily on congruence, and we were looking at congruent figures that are to check to see if they are congruent or not. Okay, today's goals is we can use distances between points to decide if two figures are congruent. So before we were looking at the side lengths, the angle measures of the figures to see if they are congruent. On today's lesson, we are shifting and looking at points that are lines or distances that are not necessarily a part of the figure. Okay, and just a reminder, when two figures are congruent, every point on one figure has a corresponding point on the other figure. So right here, this is what we did in our warm-up. We have A right here on the original. The figure is translated to the right. A prime corresponds to A. Right here, you see B prime corresponds to B. D prime corresponds to D, and these figures, these are the points that I'm blocking with my face. You can see C prime would be right there on the same on the other side. E, where would E go? E would correspond to this point right here. There's no point there, and that's what we were looking at first, is looking at the corresponding parts. Okay, the main big ideas for today's lesson is that when two figures are congruent, there is a sequence of transformations, meaning you can do a translation, rotation, and reflection to match one figure to the other one, and it will match perfectly. So if you are translating or rotating or reflecting, if you are doing a sequence of rigid transformations, then the one figure will move to fit exactly on top of the other figure. And that includes all the corresponding parts, all the points. So right here, you can see this one here on the right is a translation of this one here on the left. If you translate it, all of the points, EJ will line up with E prime, J prime. They will all fit. That's what it means to be congruent. Okay, big idea number 2. To show that two figures are not congruent, it is enough to find corresponding points which are not the same distance apart. So if you can find one thing on the figures that is not the same thing, then that is enough to say that the figures are not congruent. So here's our flip grid. The response you did on flip grid is we said we were deciding to see if these faces are congruent. Well, you can see right here that the ovals are congruent. The measurements, you can count them, they are the same. But the inside, the eyes, the distance between the eyes is different in the figure. So each eye corresponds to the eye. It's not the same. The mouth corresponds to the mouth, but you see it does not fit exactly the same. So that is not congruent. Okay, and our third big idea is the distance between pairs of corresponding points in congruent figures is the same. So what we did is we were looking at these figures. These are reflection. So this is a reflection of the other one. You can see that these lines here, BC and B prime, C prime, these are not part of the figure, but their line segment, their distance is the same because the figures are congruent. So we drew these lines, AD and then A prime, D prime. We drew the lines, we looked at the measurements, and you can see that they are the same, even though they are not a part of the figure exactly, but the distance in between those points are congruent. Okay? So then just reviewing our goals for the day, we use the distances between those 2 points in the 2 figures to see if they are congruent. If the distances are the same, then it could be congruent. If they are not the same, if you find one thing that is not the same, then they are not congruent. All right? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.